Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and I want to know something about geothermal, don't you? I mean, we hear all the time about solar and wind, but what is this thing about geothermal energy? I kind of want some. so, so I've gone to Cornell University, and we're going to be talking to Professor Jefferson Tester, who is an engineering professor at Cornell. He's a professor of sustainable energy systems and a principal scientist for the university's Earth Source Heat project, which I think is another word for geothermal engineering, right?
Right.
Good morning, Jefferson
Morning.
Tester.
Morning. Thank you so much for letting me have an opportunity to tell your audience about geothermal energy, because it is, in my view, greatly misunderstood and perhaps undervalued because of that. So I'm going to try to show a few slides, and we'll start there. And I hope you'll interrupt me when you want to see questions answered or whatever. Okay, so let's try this, see if it works. Okay, so you should be looking at sort of an interesting diagram here. So the context for this is Cornell is involved in a very ambitious program to try and decarbonize the entire campus. And we're not just doing it for the sake of saying we could do it at Cornell because we're an Ivy League institution and ought to be doing things like this. It really is meant to be sort of the beginning, hopefully, of a transformative process that could work in New York and many of the northern tier states of the United States, and for that matter in Canada, where there's a huge heating demand. And if we look at the way that heat is supplied, which I'll talk about in a minute, it will require some large change from the current practice to what we need to do in the future. And we think that geothermal, as we're calling it, earth source heat, sort of our name for the program and project we're involved with at Cornell, could perhaps fill part of that need in a very interesting way, fairly efficiently and hopefully economically affordable as well. So first, I want to just make the case, and this is primarily focused on the US, but I think you can translate that to other places pretty easily, particularly ones that have a large heating demand. So what we have plotted on this graph, although it looks complicated, it's actually not so hard to understand. On this axis along the horizontal here, this is the temperature at which a particular energy resource is actually being utilized. So if it's hot water heating, and these are all in centigrade here or Celsius, so this is down below the boiling point significantly. If we're doing air conditioning or clothes drying or other applications, most of the bars that are showing here in the yellow and red represent residential, commercial, some industrial use, as you can see up here at the top. And on the vertical scale is the total energy demand, the total amount of primary energy we consume per year in the whole United States for these particular functions, if you will. So now this only makes sense. You don't know what these units are like, but an exajoule is a very large unit of energy. It turns out we use 100 of these every year, and this is equivalent to many equivalent millions of barrels of oil or cubic meters of gas, or however unit you want to put it in. But the key thing is that about 25% of it, or 20% or so, below the boiling point of water, comes from primarily burning natural gas and oil. A little bit of
hold on.
propane.
When you say 100 exajoules,
yeah.
is that for the U.S. per year?
Yeah, per total for the U.S. That includes everything, all of the electricity we generate, all the transportation fuels, all of the heating and industrial activities that go on throughout the whole country.
From any source.
Any source, but it's the primary energy that goes into generating those so-called end uses, okay? And those end uses are described up here in these categories. You know, it could be tied to commercial. It turns out a lot of low temperature energy is used for food processing. A fair amount is obviously used, a tremendous amount for space heating and water heating. As you can see, that's when you see 14 on here, that's 14% of the total US energy demand. So it's not small.
Okay, let me
sure, please.
You're dealing with a really slow, I
Take your
I've
time.
never been good in science, even in high school. But now let me see. Let me look at this tall bar. This tall bar is for, what is it? For between 40 and 60 watt.
Centigrade temperature. So
if
when we,
you're,
so when we heat up water to put in a hot water heater for a home, we don't put it in at the boiling point. We might put it in below that, but we use it for washing dishes, for clothes, for things like that. But it's warmer than we need for actually heating the house itself, where that might be done with hot water heat or some sort of air heating. This is how the utilization temperature, effectively, where the actual energy is utilized. So not necessarily where
most of our energy is going to be used for heating things up to 40 to 60 degrees.
Yeah, right.
And the yellow part is
tied to the commercial sector, right?
And so commercial water heating is a small section, but the biggest one is commercial space heating.
Right.
Except now here we have this brown bar, which is a residential space heating
and water heating.
And water heating.
Yeah.
And this blue-green one is what?
Industrial.
Right. Okay. Okay. I got that.
So it kind of makes sense. And, the commercial includes sort of everything. It's every large store you go into. It's municipal buildings. It would be considered something at the level of Cornell University or a large hospital complex. Mm-hmm. Anything that's not residential would be considered commercial. So it covers a pretty big sector. Mm-hmm. But the amazing thing to me was when we did this study, none of us really realized how much of this is being provided by combustion. And when we burn things, we burn them at a very high temperature. Roughly in this scale, it would be 2,000 degrees or so, certainly well above 1,000. And then we essentially degrade that value back down to 40 or 50 or 60 degrees when we use it. So maybe we're not getting the most value out of that combustion energy either. Right.
Very much like a wasteful thing. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Not only from an energy use point of view, but also from a carbon dioxide generation. So we have to kind of think about how to do this better. And I'll show you some ways that this can be done better. Okay. So that's that slide. If we're good, I'll move to the next one. So now this is another kind of picture that sort of puts it in context. Why is this important? Well, it turns out, in spite of the fact that we've been slow as a country to take on national goals for decarbonization, the state governors and the state offices have not been slow on this. And it turns out right now that I think something like 16 states in the US have adopted very aggressive policies towards bringing their carbon footprint down. New York is one of them, but all the New England states, certainly many of these states up here in the northern tier where they have a large heating load. So the darker colors, the redder or oranger colors, reflect how much of their total residential and commercial sector energy is consumed as heat versus how much is going into heat plus electricity. So if you look at a state like Arizona or Texas, they have a lot less heating demand than we have up here in New England, or what you would have in Canada, certainly in the northern tier. So you would expect that a larger fraction of their total energy consumption would go into electricity rather than for heating. So this is why we think this is important. We're defining it as sort of the northern tier. And now
let me see if I'm getting this. Dark spots mean if you live there, you're spending most of your energy on heat.
Relative to electricity. It takes out the transportation because that's another big piece. So we take out cars and trucks. So we're just comparing heating with electricity because most of the electricity in the US, I'll bring some exceptions to that, is generated by combustion, by thermal processes, burning natural gas, a little bit of coal, obviously getting less coal, and some oil. But most of it is coming from natural gas. Some of it's coming from nuclear power and some of it from hydro, but the majority is coming from burning fuels. So this is when we compare heat consumption for utilization in that residential and commercial sector, we're comparing it with total heat production or consumption plus electricity consumption. So it's It's when it's really red, it means a lot of that energy footprint is tied up in heating alone, not
Which
just
is
electricity.
probably because they're in a cold area.
Exactly. And you'll see that coming up too. So the sort of takeaway points, 20 to 40% of the carbon footprint in these reddish states or darker colored states is tied up with heating. And so if you're the governor of New York or the governor of Maine or something like that, and you say, we need to decarbonize, they have to be thinking about how are they going to get down to a very low carbon footprint. If 30 to 40%, it turns out in New York, it's over 40% of the carbon footprint is in heating. You're going to have to think about a better way to heat homes at low carbon. So that's one of the motivations behind why we're so interested in this now. And so 16 states, as I mentioned, have these aggressive policies to decarbonize. Going to have to think about a renewable low carbon way to take care of their heating demand if they're going to get to very decarbonized state. And so the final point here is you can't do this alone with just electric heating. A lot of people say, well, we'll just use electric heating, because if you think about this, the way in which we're going to supply electricity in a decarbonized mode is sort of the way you started this presentation today, Meta, was that it's going to really require a lot of solar and wind, okay, primarily, unless we build a lot more nuclear plants. So let's assume it's coming from solar and wind, and this part of the country, like Canada, is pretty dark in the wintertime. You know, we're at high latitude. The weather's bad. The sort of availability of solar is very low. And just the time when you need it the most, for the coldest days of the year, you're not going to have that renewable energy. So in our view, it won't come directly with electric transformation the way we're doing it now. We're going to have to use some direct use. And it turns out that geothermal may be that kind of answer. And it is being done in other countries. Particularly in Europe.
Now, I've already learned something inferentially, so let me see if I'm correct. Because I think what I've learned is that you're talking about using geothermal for heating, but it's not of any value for electricity.
Not quite. This would be it depends, right? Like a lot of things in engineering. If we live in the eastern part of the U.S., the geothermal resources are not as high quality as they are in the American West. I'll get to this in a minute. So it turns out, little to probably many of your listeners, they probably don't realize that the United States is the largest producer of geothermal electricity in the world, right?
No.
But it's primarily in 3 states out here, in Nevada and California, a little bit in Arizona, and some distributed up in the Pacific Northwest.
Really?
But very interesting. But there, the grade, as we call it, the temperatures of that geothermal resource are easier to get to in a shallower mode. So they're so-called higher grade. In the east of the Mississippi, basically, we're going to have to do the best we can with lower temperatures that we have in the ground. And so if you think of geothermal as a resource that has to be accessible from the surface, usually by drilling, you want to make sure you get to temperatures that would be useful. But recall the graph that I showed before this, which said, well, if we're doing heating, we only need to get to temperatures that could provide heat at 40 to 60 or 70 degrees centigrade. But if we're going to make electricity, because that's also a thermal conversion from thermal to electric, we need to get to higher temperatures to make it efficient. So
you need to, so that you can boil water for the turbines. Is that?
Well, yeah, but you'd even like to be well above the turbine, the sort of boiling point. Typically, a geothermal resource will be, a good one will be well over 150 centigrade, so 50 degrees above the boiling point, or even 250. And the higher temperature you go, the more efficient it is to convert to electricity. So this is why these Western states can still produce reliable, competitive geothermal electricity, but it won't be.
Let me see how they do it. The way they do it is by just steam turbines, the way other sources of electricity do. Right?
Exactly. There are two primary methods. One is exactly as you say. They would take either steam out of the ground, which is pretty rare, or very hot water out of the ground and produce steam with it, and then run it through a steam turbine connected to a generator and generate power that way, just the way we do with a thermal cycle right now with natural gas. The big difference is you're not coming in at the combustion temperature of the natural gas. You're coming in at whatever that resource has available to you. And the other method, which is sometimes used for lower temperature fluids, is you take the geothermal water out of the ground and you transfer it to a secondary fluid, usually something that boils at a lower temperature than water. It has a higher pressure of operation, and it's usually called an organic Rankine cycle. And there are many of these around the world. There are a few in the US, but many distributed around the world in developing countries as well as developed countries. And they reliably produce electricity as well. The advantage of that type of a cycle, if you will, over the steam cycle is that they will re-inject all of the fluid back into the ground and have no emissions at all. So they'll have no carbon dioxide emissions, no other emissions to deal with. Whereas a steam system has possible disadvantages in that it will have some dissolved gases that might be in that water as it's produced, and they get separated, and that contains some CO2, small amounts compared to burning fossil fuels, but still is another issue. And so that is one reason why organic Rankine cycles, as they're called, because they're completely closed on the geothermal side, are becoming more attractive.
Now, what are some of these fluids that are not water that you could use?
Some of them are hydrocarbons that are, and again, they're in closed cycles as well. Okay, so they never see the light of day. So they could be low molecular weight hydrocarbons, isobutane, pentane, things like that, or they could be so-called refrigerants. But these would be different than the refrigerants that we put in our home air conditioners and things like that. These would be ones that would be very attractive for the geothermal conditions of converting them into power. And they're being looked at very well. They use a lot of them now. Some of them would have some concerns if they were released for global warming, but most of them are regulated now and have very low effective carbon footprints or global warming potential. And they're usually non-flammable, which is better than using hydrocarbons, and they are extremely non-corrosive. So that's another advantage of operating them in a geothermal system.
And you would just heat them too, just the way you would water otherwise.
Yeah, you'd heat them with the hot water. So there'd be a heat exchanger at the front end of the power plant. Mm-hmm. And then you'd heat that organic fluid up, produce a vapor, and then expand that vapor in not a steam turbine, but in an organic turbine, tie it to a generator and generate power. Mm-hmm. Now, this sounds pretty elaborate, but we're going to show you a way that we can eliminate a lot of that equipment, if you will, when we use it directly for heat, because there we're just going to exchange the heat itself and put it into a district heating system. Okay. And that's fundamentally different. So maybe we should keep moving.
Yep.
Okay. So this I think makes the point as that we talked about earlier, why there's very high grade resources in the West. So this is a map that represents what the temperatures would be at a very deep environment if we just kept drilling down. So 5.5 kilometers below the surface of the Earth in the continental US here. And the colors represent different temperatures. So when we get to the purples and reds, we're at very high temperatures now. The purple is actually above 300 centigrade. And when we're in the range of the yellows and oranges, we're still at a useful temperature, but it's much lower. The yellow is about 100 degrees. If we go in these gray areas, it would be below 100. But in all cases, if we use this for heating, virtually all of the country, not just the American West, would be attractive. That California has a very large geothermal electricity plant here about 90 miles north of San Francisco at the field called the Geysers. There are some in Southern California. There are many in Nevada. I put Yellowstone National Park on here just to show you we're not going into Yellowstone Park, but you can just see what a high grade natural geothermal resource it is. But virtually all of the West is. So I think the focus will be that you'd use a lot of the geothermal here, not for heating because you don't have much heating load. It would be more for electricity. Whereas in the East and the Northeast and even the Northern Tier, you want to use it directly for heat.
Okay, if you generate it out there and then send it east, how much of it are you going to lose that way?
You would lose a lot. Okay. And the point is, it's not going to solve the entire country's footprint for electricity. We like to use this, and this is really an example of what Cornell's trying to do. This is an energy system problem. We have to put all the pieces together and do it in a way where it makes sense. One of my favorite quotes is from Teddy Roosevelt that talks about resources. And he makes this quote. He says, "You do what you can with what you have where you are. If you're sitting in the Southwest, you have an enormous solar resource. You have a good high temperature geothermal resource. If you're up here in the Great Lakes region or offshore, you might want to use more wind and maybe less solar, but you still have this high heating demand. So you're kind of stuck with, what are you going to use? Now, biomass might be another possibility, but it turns out biomass, we're blessed with biomass in the US, but we also have a huge energy demand. So it isn't going to solve this in a sustainable way. And a lot of biomass work now is being directed towards carbon-free fuels for transportation, which might make more sense from this kind of let's do what we can that makes sense. So it's an energy system criteria. And I think geothermal fits into that. It's not a total solution, though, Meta. And I don't think people should walk away from this. All we need to do now is convert over to geothermal. I think what makes sense is use it at the appropriate manner. Another feature about geothermal, I think, that makes it attractive out in the West is that it's on all the time. It's always available. It doesn't depend on whether the wind's blowing or the sun's out or whether it's night or day. So it complements the solar and wind resources that we have. And that's a huge feature for managing the ups and downs of interruptible renewable power that they have a lot of in the West. So all of those features are good. In the East, we're going to have a high demand in the wintertime for heating for sure, but less in the summer. But a district system where we distribute it to many buildings at once in communities, larger cities, even smaller communities, makes a lot more sense from an efficiency point of view. Mm-hmm. So and Cornell is a good location to do that for a couple of reasons. One, it's in a relatively high grade area, which means we wouldn't have to drill as deep for an initial type demonstration. And we have a large energy use and demand on campus, as you'll see soon. Okay, so if we move to this gives you kind of a cartoon picture of what Cornell's trying to do. And about 20 years ago or so, they decided to take care of, and it wasn't primarily directed by carbon, but it was certainly directed towards lowering their energy demand from burning fossil fuels or running electricity systems. They decided to use the lake itself. We have a huge deep lake here, Cayuga Lake, which has over 2 trillion gallons of water in it, and it's very deep. So at the bottom of that lake, which is 300 to 400 feet or so, the temperatures are just a few degrees above the freezing point of water. And so the method here was to extract this during the summer from the lower parts of the lake, run it through a heat exchanger down at the edge of the lake below Cornell, and then exchange that with a circulating fluid that goes through Cornell's district, in this case, the district cooling side of the university. So this was
wait a minute. I've got to work on this a little bit.
Sure. Okay.
Now, when you say you're going to get it out of the bottom of the lake, what are you going to get out?
Cold water.
Cold.
Very cold water.
I thought that heat is heat.
Oh yeah, well I'm just giving you
is the absence of heat.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm giving you the analog of what Cornell put in 20 years ago that mimics what we're trying to do for heating. This is a renewable cooling system that's part of the strategy to decarbonize the campus, but we have to do it for the summer as well as the winter. And the cooling load at Cornell is less than the heating demand. So we have a bigger problem in the winter, but we've already done it for cooling. So we don't have to replace the refrigeration side of Cornell using electrically driven heat pump systems or something like that to cool the campus, which is very important because that means we can focus on heating alone, because this is already done. And it's on only when we need it. The cold water is taken from the deep part of the lake, the same way we'd be taking hot water from a geothermal system, and then it goes through a heat exchanger, and then we deposit it after we put some energy into it from the campus cooling loop to the upper part of the lake, which is actually warm in the summer. So there's a natural stratification of this, and it's a very small footprint, if you will, thermal footprint on the lake because the lake is so large.
Okay.
The typical cooling load's about 30 megawatts. Okay, so, but there's other pieces to this. Well, over on the right here, we're showing the heating side. So the idea would be to connect to Cornell's district heating infrastructure, which is already in place, to supply it with sufficiently hot water so that it could provide heating, both for hot water heat and for hot water supply to the buildings, labs, dormitories, office space, classrooms for the whole campus. We have about 30,000 of us on this campus and a pretty big heating demand in the winter. It turns out that the electricity demand is more or less uniform over the whole year. So that allows us to imagine a renewable system. So we're showing it here, sort of depicting it. Here's some solar collectors. We have a small hydroelectric plant already in place, but it's not enough for the whole campus. The electric load is about 30 megawatts electric. The heating load is actually bigger than that, even the base load, if you will, for heating. And on a really, really cold day, we can easily get to 80 or 90 megawatts of thermal heat demand for the campus. So we need something that can respond to that in a large way during these winter months, of which we have many.
You say that, am I inferring that there's no place on campus where there's a local hot water heater or heater or anything like that? You get everything out already out of this this racetrack looking thing.
Right, we do, but we don't provide it with geothermal yet. We now do it with a very efficient natural gas fired power plant that does both, generates the electricity we need and the heat we need at a very high efficiency, but it's got a carbon footprint. So if you want to decarbonize and go to carbon neutrality, you really have to, change the way in which you're heating.
Now, about this district heating, I remember visiting Moscow a lot, and they have something I think is like what you're talking about. All of the buildings
exactly
get theirs from the same sources, and you can even see when it snows, you can see where the thing is underground because there's a little heat
right, exactly,
melting the snow above it.
Right.
But my impression is that there are very few places in the U.S. that heat things that way.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that's a big, big challenge. And that is probably the biggest challenge we have in front of us, because if we aren't willing to fix the way in which we heat buildings right now, just if you think about this, it took me a while to kind of get around this myself or get it into my head, but we basically deliver the energy to individual homes, commercial buildings, in the form of natural gas or oil for heating. And then they burn it in a furnace at very high temperatures and produce the heat they need. They're not doing combined heat and power for sure, nor are they going into a general infrastructure. There's a little bit of that in some cities in the US, a little bit of district heating, but nowhere near as extensive as Europe. And certainly not as efficient for sure. And
so Europe is like Russia in that respect.
Well, I think, exactly. But there are places in Europe, particularly if you look at Iceland, which is considered in Europe, although half the countries in North America too, on a geologic basis. But they basically heat all of the buildings in their country right now with geothermal. But they have an exquisite district heating program that they put in, and they had to do it. As the former president of Iceland would say, we had to do it building by building, house by house, street by street. We're still going to have to do that. And that requires, I think, a very different sort of value system we have now for infrastructure. There's been a lot of interest in the discussion today politically about we need new infrastructure. But if we can find it just to bridges and roads, we're missing a huge opportunity, I think, for transforming our aging cities, of which we have many in the Northeast, particularly where we have heating demand, and across the northern tier for that matter, that really could use a boost in the way in which they supply energy to all the buildings. So Cornell's system is in some sense ahead of this, but it made sense for a university because it's essentially paying for this resource to provide heating for all the buildings. So why not do it as efficiently as possible? Now, the only problem with the Moscow system is its higher temperature too. It was probably going in as steam, and that results in a lot of losses. You were seeing some of those losses when you see snow melting. So the idea of a real modern heating system now is to go to very low temperatures. And the losses in the distribution piping, we have hundreds of kilometers of pipe underground at the campus right now. The losses go down because the temperatures are lower with the ground, so you have less heat loss. And so that's a big plus. And what ends up, if you took the energy out of the ground, say at 80 degrees centigrade or so, and went into this district heating system, you would probably be able to utilize well over 90% of it effectively for heating the buildings themselves and heating the hot water supply and things like that, and only lose, a few percent, perhaps 5%, 6%. That's remarkable. And it also would have the advantage of not having any carbon, right? Because the water that comes out of the ground in this geothermal cartoon, as we're showing it here now, is brought up to the surface, cooled off, and then re-injected back in to be reheated. So it's completely free of any emissions for sure. And we have an efficient system of heat exchange only. No turbines required, no extra heat exchangers, only one simple heat exchanger. And we don't have to worry about generating electricity. We're using the heat directly. So that's kind of why I think that this might represent something very economic as opposed to trying to make electricity with this lower temperature resource. So if you think about this in kind of a simple way, if I gave you, let's say, 100 units of energy, thermal energy that we're taking out of the ground here at, say, 80 degrees, say, just below the boiling point, and I tried to turn it into electric power, which I could, I would get less than 5 units or so of that back as electricity because the efficiency is low. But if I use that same resource for providing heat, I'm going to get 90+% of it, 95%. So the value of the heat delivered versus the lower grade electricity or lower amount of electricity delivered is significant. And that really affects the economics. It changes the whole structure of the way you'd put in a geothermal system once you go to direct use. But what it needs, as you've pointed out, Meta, is it needs infrastructure. We have to be able to make a commitment to put in the required district heating infrastructure. And I think I view it as an opportunity for the country. A lot of people would say, well, it's impossible. Well, the Icelanders did this. They started 50 years or so ago, and they did the whole country. And if Iceland can do it with much fewer resources and much less financial capability than we have, we could do it too. But it will take some time. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're not on that path right now. It's just as you said, there are few and far between examples. There are a few enlightened places, but they're very few, and they don't even touch those big bars we showed in those graphs before. And that's what we're going to have to do. So is that, you got the picture now?
Got the picture. Okay. You have more slides, or is this it?
No, I got a couple more. I want to just show you what we're trying to do here. So this is a more enlargement of the same program or same slide I showed before. This also shows that we're trying to form coalitions with wind to provide that, solar, and the little hydro we have to kind of take care of the electricity part of our carbon footprint. The lake source cooling provides the cooling part, and the district heating system would provide it from geothermal. Looks like it would do a good job on the heat supply. However, there's one little feature to this that is not so obvious here. We show a biomass facility over here with biofuel, and we looked at a lot of options for the campus, and it turns out that when you try to provide heat, one of the advantages, if you're going to pay for this infrastructure and all of this drilling and putting in this subsurface system, you want to make sure you get the most value out of it. So you want to have the highest load factor, capacity factor that you can get. And it turns out, if we look at the campus and say, okay, on an annual basis, 50 megawatts of thermal is about what we need for baseload heating. Where are we going to get the heat when we have those really, really cold days? Okay, well, on those cold days, fortunately of which there are only about 20 a year on average, at least in Ithaca, where Cornell is, we can probably do that if we used biomass in some way. And it turns out and this is a study we just completed, Cornell is, as I mentioned, the land-grant institution in New York. It has a big agriculture school where they have dairy cows, roughly 600 cows. And we have a lot of students on campus that eat a lot of food, and they generate a lot of food waste. And we looked at just taking the manure that comes out of those cows every day. That's something you can count on too, by the way. Cornell provides all of the dairy products for the campus, including milk and cheese and yogurt and ice cream for the whole campus. And those cows produce a lot of manure. And if we can take that manure and essentially go through a process that anaerobically digests it, turns it to biogas, and then do some other steps with that, and combine that process with some residual food waste, we can more than make up the extra amount of energy we need for those 20 cold days. And the beauty of this is that we already have a natural gas infrastructure, and the biogas we'd produce looks chemically exactly like natural gas, because we're going to remove the carbon dioxide from it. It'll look like methane, but it's biomethane and has a very low carbon footprint. So in a sense, we can use part of the infrastructure we have already for heating on those really cold days, but we will have the base load provided by by geothermal heating, which is by far the most economic thing. And I think I have one or two more slides that show this.
Yeah, but I really love the idea, but I can imagine that some of your vegan students are going to have fits, right?
Well, we do all of, well, maybe, but there's vegans and then there's people that don't eat meat. And I think they are a little different, but what I'm finding, and I've learned a lot about the whole dairy part of this, is that we're talking dairy cows here that produce an unbelievably nutritional thing that supplements, the kind of diets you'd have to put together if you went totally vegan. So there's no question we're going to have a lot of food waste one way or the other. Even if it's vegan food waste, it will get digested. I mean, dairy cows, if you think about it, are remarkable chemical processing plants. They eat grass and turn it into food for us. And so it's kind of something to think about. You don't have to convince me, because right. I'm on the opposite side. I kind of think that there are lots of reasons why we need animals. Right,
and
exactly.
I'm not ready to get rid of them the way my vegan friends are, but that's a whole different
but it's a balance. It's a matter of balance, I think. And we've got it. We obviously want a balanced diet, but we want a nutritious diet, and we don't want to overload this with too much meat in a diet. But dairy cows, to me, are fundamentally different. They're producing such a diverse set of nutritional products that it might make sense. And they're here anyways. Okay, we have a veterinary college here, and we train animal scientists to operate dairy farms. So they're here. They're part of our environmental footprint right now. So if we can make that better by using some of the waste, that's a good thing.
Okay, now let me think of another issue, and that is you've got an eminent scientist in the agriculture department or someplace who's a specialist on biochar, and I can imagine that you and he would be competing.
No, we're actually working together. Okay, so really? Johannes Lehmann is the person you're talking about. So there's a fair amount of waste that the difference between manure, let's say, and some food waste is that it's very wet. Okay, and the process that Johannes Lehmann's group optimally converts that waste into biochar is a dry process. So you would have to dry it first to get to that. So he would be much happier with drier waste, one of which is poultry litter, and two other drier woody waste, residual wood, or even grass itself and things like that. So I think remember my Roosevelt comment that we're trying to do this in a genuinely integrative fashion, where we take the waste and use them the best way we can. So we're working very closely with him, and it's not clear that this kind of anaerobic process would be the best in all cases, because when you even make biochar, you generate gas as well, some gas as a product as well as bio oil. So we're looking at all of those processes right now to see what makes sense. And so he's not a competitor. He's actually a collaborator, right? And so it's really good because I've learned a lot from him and also from the animal scientists. And so it's been, I'm an engineer, so everything has been new to me. And I think they're learning from us as well. So it's a great place for student learning and engagement. We use this sort of living laboratory concept to get students and faculty involved in a very multidisciplinary way, which I think is the way we're going to have to solve these problems. It's not going to be done in just one discipline, but this is the concept. But let me just summarize a few things, and I think this will be a good way to kind of get to close to the end here. So if we could demonstrate this earth source heat concept on campus, it to me represents sort of first the ability to show we can actually reach these temperatures at reasonable depths. This is about 10,000, a little bit short of 10,000 feet to maybe 13,000 feet or so. This is way shallower than we drill now for a lot of oil and gas wells. So the technology for drilling is there. That's not going to be a problem. Are the costs going to be attractive? We want to develop a 2-well system, as I showed. This is a sort of a blow up where you'd have a cold water side and a hot water side, and you would circulate over a large volume of rock mass. And that's the biggest technical challenge that I think we have in any geothermal development, whether it's here or Nevada or Iceland.
That's fracking, is it?
Well, it's not really fracking. It's taking advantage of what nature gives you. And in some cases, you have enough permeability and porosity or natural fractures that are already there. We've seen this a lot in the formations that have been used in geothermal systems. So we would be circulating something that's already there in a state that can be used. It may require some additional, what we'll call stimulation, but it's very different than the high volume hydraulic fracturing that's used for gas shale, because those formations are really tight. The only way you get the gas out is to fracture the heck out of them so you get access to it. That will not be the case here. The other advantage, if you want to look at it as advantage, you're still doing things in the underground, is that we utilize the water. Water is an enemy to gas production because you have to dispose of the water. We actually use the water as part of the heat extraction medium. So it is sort of fundamentally different. This shot down here, this photo on the, I don't know whether it's your left or right, but you can see, this is the lower portion of the lake. The lake is about 50 miles long or so, left after the ice age. The deep end is down here at the Cornell end. This is a picture of part of the campus. This is the part we're probably going to start heating first. And another feature of this, there are a lot of greenhouses associated with the agriculture college. They use very low grade heat, but right now they're being heated with steam, which is crazy, right? So they are the biggest energy sink on the campus right now, which we can greatly improve. And they also would have to be lit in the wintertime for sure, because it's dark most of the time. And that we would do with renewable electricity. So let's keep going. So one of the big challenges after we get to this 2-well demonstration is to make sure we can get enough water circulated through this, because that's going to justify the economics and the financial investment. And it's got to last long enough. So these 2 bullets here are what we're working on from an engineering point of view. And the only way you really find out is by trying it. And there's lots of modeling techniques we've been using. A lot of work has been done in applied earth sciences that we can apply to this. Some of it comes from oil and gas development. Some of it comes from other sort of geologic earth science investigations, but it's still a technical challenge. And another reason why it makes sense maybe to start slow, do this at a university.
But wait a minute, one thing is this water, you're not using up water, you're using the same water in a closed
over and over and over. Yeah, but we have to be able to make sure that it flows out of each of these wells or into these wells at that rate, because we have to extract enough thermal energy to justify the investment that's going to be made in drilling
so
these
it
wells.
Might get down there and seep away, right? Is that the
Well, it could, but one of the strategies here in any geothermal system, you usually pump from the production well. So you create a sort of lower pressure sink here in the production well. So all of the water would tend to be attracted. Once it's released from the injection side, it would migrate over to the lowest pressure point, which will be in that production well, and come out. Most of the history in this a lot of the geothermal power plants that I talked about early on when we were out in Nevada, they do this. They do total reinjection, and they actually have been quite sustainable. Some of the systems in operation in Italy and in Iceland and New Zealand have been running for many, many decades with little or no production loss because they have essentially a natural closed loop circulation. But you have to be able to have the right pressure gradient across it. So usually that's done by pumping in the production well, reducing the pressure over on that side. Good question. And this was back to my point, 50 megawatts base load, an option for biomass peak heating using renewable natural gas generated from campus ag and food waste. So that's kind of the Cornell story. And I think we could, if you want to, we can kind of end here or take more questions.
No, I doubt that anybody, because we're not live, there's nobody calling in with questions, and they probably wouldn't anyway. But I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
It isn't necessarily about the system I see here, but what I was hoping you were going to do to make me happy, because I have a concern that I don't think many other people share. It doesn't keep me awake at night, but I don't like it. I don't like too much centralization.
I got it. Right.
I don't like becoming, the entire hemisphere depending on one electric grid or something like that.
Got it. Right. Got it.
Last week we had a power outage, and I knew it was going to happen. They gave me warning, so I could have prepared certain things. But, it was a reminder to me of how many things we now use that depend on electricity, because I couldn't open the refrigerator because I didn't want the heat to come and go. I couldn't, use my microwave to warm up my coffee. I couldn't make coffee. I couldn't do this or this or this. Or
right.
that.
Right. Okay.
So, and then I think, here, look at that they've knocked out the pipeline for this colonial outfit.
Right.
One little
right.
guy
right,
comes along with one little computer thing, and he knocks out, the whole damn thing. Well, look, we are very vulnerable when we set up everything we do in life based on one single electric grid and just hope that our enemies don't figure out how to knock it out, or hope that there's no such thing as really a Carrington event that's going to wipe out the whole electrical system of half of the planet. Right. I don't like that. So what I thought was, I'm going to talk to this guy because he's going to teach me how to dig a hole in my backyard and get everything I need for my own house.
Okay.
Just independently. And besides which, I can, if I had a house, which I don't because I live in a high rise, if I had a house, I could put solar panels on and have my own electricity separate from the grid, et cetera. So that's what I want him to teach me. And you haven't done it.
Okay, okay. Well, let me take it in stages. This is a really great question, Meta. So let's start first at the Cornell stage. Okay, that's not the whole grid for sure. That's a smaller community, right? We looked at all of the communities in New York and Pennsylvania and said, what would be possible here? We're not going to put in one single system. This is a self-contained system that takes care of the campus. It provides the electricity. It doesn't depend on the colonial pipeline once we go away from carbon, right? It depends only on the earth and renewable resources that we have access to, including the lake, solar, wind. So it solves the problem at that scale. But now, and I think that would be true of geothermal in general. It's naturally a distributed resource. It's not thousands of megawatts. It's tens or hundreds of megawatts. So it's providing something that is locally consumed. So it provides more, quote, resilience is the word we use now, in case there isn't a major outage. When we have losses of power in New York, which happen once in a while, as you can imagine, Cornell disconnects itself from the grid because it supplies power back to the grid, and we just are completely isolated we just provide our own power. But we also provide power back to the grid when we can to help them out as well. So it can work in both ways. I think we need distributed resources, like you're saying, that can become independent if they need to in times like when we have a colonial pipeline issue or when there's a major electric grid outage. And we don't have enough of that for sure. When they take things down, it takes a whole state down, as it did in Texas. And we've had these in the Northeast, as you know, that even affected, I think, part of Canada. some decades ago. And
Yeah.
so I think it's a big deal, and we need to make a much more resilient, more distributed system. It won't solve everything, but it will definitely make it better. But at the individual house level, I can at least share with you what I do. Okay, when we moved to Ithaca, I was at MIT a long time, and we couldn't do all the things we wanted to there, even though we live kind of far away from Cambridge, Mass. But when I came to Ithaca, my wife and I said, look, we're going to try to build something that's near as zero carbon as we possibly can. After all, it's in my DNA to say we ought to do this. I'm running an energy program. So we looked at this, and we faced the reality of how hard this is to do in an existing house. If you try to retrofit an existing house, it might not have the right orientation for solar. It might be difficult to dig up the back and put in a geothermal system. So we went, after a while of looking at places that existed in the local community, we said, okay, we're going to have to build a house. And so this also created new challenges for us, because who knows about this, right? So I had to search for people that were familiar. Now we're really talking about geothermal heat pumps as opposed to a deep geothermal system. So the option that we pursued was we did a trench system in the backyard, and we built a very efficient house, the kind you'd want to build in Canada if you were starting from scratch. Incredibly good efficiency for insulation in the walls and roof and basement, good windows. And we went to as much a system where we could use solar hot water supply from solar thermal panels and solar photovoltaic for electricity. But yet we had to be connected to the grid, right? Because the sun's not out in the winter. But on an average basis, my house comes very close to being net zero energy. In other words, in the summer, I produce a lot of electricity, which goes to the grid and goes into a bank there, and then I bring it back in the wintertime. Seasonal loads, though, are really tough to come by, and you would have the same problem if you did it in Canada.
Actually, I can tell you of a guy who did, because I did an interview with a guy named Art Hunter who lives in Ottawa. Who's a retired engineer, and he has retrofitted his whole house.
So he knows.
Yeah, and he says he put in. He was describing geothermal that he did, and it sounded like your trench idea, because it showed something like a trench in the backyard. I didn't understand it. There you go. But he's got all kinds of doodads all over the house, and we did the interview in the basement, which looked like a great engineering lab. Anyway,
right, that's my basement looks the same way, but it runs remarkably well, though, even in the winter. And I think that the challenge here is that, and I think they're beginning to look at this in Canada and the Northeast. If we could figure out a way to seasonally store some of that energy, because we have a lot of excess in the summer, and utilize it in the winter. In sort of the old days of when they had ice houses, right? We need something that stores heat. And I think that the recharge of these shallow geothermal systems could be looked at in a very productive way. And the Europeans are doing this, shallow aquifers and things like that. So that's part of the Cornell strategy here also, is to think about seasonal storage.
He says he can do, he does it for, I've forgotten how many days a year, but I think there are maybe 2.5 months when he doesn't even try to make his goal.
Right, exactly.
But he's completely off the grid, and he lives off
the grid. That's awesome.
Yeah, except for those like 2.5 months.
Yeah, and it is hard in the winter. There's no question about that. But I'm impressed with how, once you have a relatively, you probably had to do some things to improve the energy efficiency of the home, I'm sure. But once you can take those measures, it makes a huge difference. I mean, our house is very comfortable because there's almost no heat loss from it to the outside. So you can sit against the cold wall and not freeze to death in the wintertime. And so it's great from that point of view. And
to what extent can this be, I don't want to use the word scaled up, because I'm talking about diversity of things. Is it reasonable for an ordinary family to talk about putting a trench or something in the backyard to get geothermal for their own household? Is that a rational, even thing to think about?
Well, I think it definitely is doable. And in fact, we give our students problems like this, both exam and homework problems, all the time in different locations, because one of the problems, I won't call it a problem, one of the challenges that we have is that we have very, very low cost natural gas right now. And so to compete with that, somebody has to say, well, we're going to help you. If you produce low carbon, we either going to put a damage price on the CO2 that's generated from using natural gas, or we're going to incentivize the other thing. But it's not a level playing field. There is no damage cost put into carbon dioxide right now in the US. So I would find that it would be hard for a retrofit homeowner to come in and do this and make the argument without some intervention, whether it's state or federal or some local financing help, to put it in and make it work economically. In my case, it was a little different because it was a new house. Okay, so I could start from ground zero and get very efficient in the heating and cooling system for the house, et cetera. But I think that is a barrier. The states are taking this on. New York State is trying to incentivize geothermal heat pumps because they're much, much more efficient than air source heat pumps, especially in the winter. And I think that it could happen. We've installed in the US now, I think, over 2,000 geothermal heat pump units. So, I mean, not 2,000, 2 million. I'm slightly off, 2 million. And worldwide, well, there a lot of them are in the central region of the country. Say if you looked in where you have a sort of uniform.
So you're talking 2 million for the US.
US, yeah, over 4 million probably for the whole world, and becoming increasingly incentivized, partly because they're more efficient, so they use less electricity. And if electricity prices are high, as they are in many countries, and even a few states, California, Hawaii is very expensive, New York's pretty expensive, it becomes economically more attractive because you would use a lot less electricity for cooling the house in the summer and for heating it if you used an air source heat pump, which a lot of builders are going to now because they're so efficient themselves, but they're also inexpensive. So there is a barrier. And if you can't do trenches, you can drill wells. You could easily, in your driveway, drill a couple of vertical wells to 500 feet or so and accomplish it. They're more expensive than trenches. So you could, in a pretty tightly suburban neighborhood, you'd still have room to put in wells. And it might make sense, if it's a cluster of houses, to centralize that among 10 or 12 houses to get some economy of scale. I'm not talking about a big system, not big centralized, but small distributed.
Very interesting. And I want to share it with everybody I can find, and I will. I can imagine having a conversation with people who are doing various types of energy and conservation measures and things to have a group discussion of how to have a project that would make sense for a homeowner, for example.
Right. So what you might want to talk to an individual by the name of, he has an interesting name. It's Jay Egg, EGG. And he has a company that has been looking at small systems in clusters of buildings, mainly geothermal heat pumps. And he's a very good guy. He'd be a good speaker for you too.
Good luck with your project. It's inspiring to look at and fun to think about. So,
thank you.
I'm very, very grateful to you.
Thanks for the opportunity, Meta. Keep up doing God's work here. Okay.
Thank you. You too.
Bye now.